sensual expression of love. That is again a very important characteristic of metaphysical poetry, and which is against the older idea of Platonic expression of love. So for the first time, the sensuality also enters love poetry during this particular age. At the same time, as we already said, that this age is paradoxical age, and at the same time you have the presence of dispassionate love poems of Marvel also, and took his co-mistress is a very major example. Now we see that there are many other poems written by Donne, Marvel and some other poets, and I have tried to, on your screen you can see that there are some examples that how in the Good Morrow, okay, new love is celebrated. In the sun rising, love is fulfilled, and again it is a celebrated love. In the anniversary, the poet talks about love in relation to time. In the canonization, love is celebrated as a new religion. And a very important poem, a valediction, where you have two lovers and you see that how the consolation of love on the parting of the lover is there. Okay, Donne uses a very important conceit of twin compass in this particular poem. When one lover is going away from the beloved, okay, he says that I am around you, I am not going out away from you, but I will be circling you like the compass. So such conceits are used in love poems. We also see that Herbert, who is very often tagged as a religious poet, and that's why we see that in a poem like the Pearl, there is God's love for man. So love is again a very interesting term. It is not simply love between human beings, but here we see that love for God also, man's love for God. At the same time, there is God's love for man also. In some poems of Marvel also, Bermuda for example. And in Herbert again, the Collar, you have the inevitability of God's love. In a poem like The Flower, you have the grace of God also. So we see that in Marvel, Bermudas, the mercy and the bounty of God's love is felt. At the same time, a very popular poem of Marvel, to his co-mistress, you have sexual love and the brevity of life. Okay, this particular problem, the brevity of life, is again dealt with in this particular poem in a beautiful way. So we see that how these poets woe also. Okay, and there are some important poems of woe on the screen, and you see that how in the retreat he talks about love of holiness and loss of innocence. In man he talks about man's purpose to find God beyond this life. So here you have man's love for God. Okay, it is not all the same time man's love for woman or vice versa, but it is man's love for God and again God's love for man also. Now later we talk about another important aspect of metaphysical poetry, and that is religion and God in metaphysical poetry.
In love you described, Bhavin Bhai, it seems that there are different facets of love is delineated in metaphysical poetry. Is it so?
Yeah, there are certain different facets of love, as we already used the term paradoxical, that so their understanding of love or the experience of love is again a little bit paradoxical. We see it is sensual, at the same time romantic also. It is Platonic also, and at the same time it is carnal also. So the metaphysicals are not satisfied with one experience. This is what we see, and they are realistic in this way also.
So once again pointing to the paradox, I would like to say that paradox presents before you the two extreme aspects of an issue, which can enable the reader or the listener to follow the idea in its completeness, as love and hatred, or as sun and earth, or water and earth. That is, if you want to understand something in toto, you should have different aspects in your vision or view. And therefore, metaphysical poetry always taken as a very good explanation or creation of something that you can understand very well. Now, religion and God in metaphysical poetry, as it is there on your screen, as Bhavin sir said, in the true sense of the term, metaphysical poetry is not religious, as we say bhakti, kavya, etc. There is intense agony, introspection, and simultaneous trust in God. These poems are replete with worldly experiences which are not religious in themselves. The metaphysical poets believe in the physical as well as metaphysical world. They are not totally worldly nor totally religious. In Herbert's poem, we can see man's love for God and duty towards God. In some marvelous poems, like Bermuda, as Bhavin Bhai referred, we have God's love for man. They have intense meditation, philosophizing some eternal, real life experiences of man. The another quality is secular strain in metaphysical poetry. In Donne, we have religious as well as secular strain. He says in the poem Satire of Religion, is not our mistress fair religion, as worthy of all our soul's devotion, as virtue was to the first blinded age? Thus, metaphysical poets are interested in, once again I repeat, the extreme things, secular as well as religious, spiritual, but not confined to only one aspect of the thing which is there in metaphysical poetry.
Yeah, certainly, Chaitanya Bhai. I think you cannot say that this is what
Yeah.
is metaphysical poem. You cannot put your finger on something and say that yes, this is what is metaphysical poet, and that's why many critics have kept themselves away from giving a particular definition of metaphysical poetry. Okay, Helen Gardiner in her text very clearly stated that I don't come to any conclusion. Okay, she has included about 38 poets, including all the major metaphysicals. But she says that I cannot come to one conclusion and say that this is what is a metaphysical poem. And this is again the paradoxical nature, what
Yeah.
we have already talked about so far as these poets are concerned. And this particular nature continues later also, especially when we read 20th century poetry. So in a way, the metaphysical poets actually they anticipate so many literary movements which are going to happen later. The romantics also in some sense, and again the 20th century poetry. So later we see that as far after talking about love and talking about religion in metaphysical poetry, we would like to talk about the images used in metaphysical poetry and how especially in the poetry of Donne, Herbert and Vaux, because they are the major metaphysical poets and they very peculiarly use images in their poetry. Now Donne is very much eclectic as far as all the metaphysical poets are concerned. He is more eclectic than Herbert or Vaux, you can say, in the selection of images. And we have already said that how the particular context affects the use of images. The notorious image of the twin compass in a valediction, for example. So we see that how the colonialism has set in, for example. Okay, now the exotic places have been discovered. There is lot of navigation is happening, and if you read the history of English literature, you see that the whole business of shipbuilding was the thriving business in England in 17th century. So certainly this refers to new discoveries in this particular age, what we say, and that's why the images are certainly affected. And as I have said that Donne is very much eclectic, in the use of the images, and that's why, because of this eclecticism, he is a little bit obscure also, as compared to Herbert or as compared to Vaux perhaps, or Crashaw. And we see that here, that in Donne you have images taken from new discoveries, new learning of the age, the topical discoveries also. There are references to alchemy, references to sea voyages, references to mythology, religion, etc. And that's why we see that perhaps Dryden was right in a sense that he found these poets very obscure, and that's why he said that perhaps something different should have been written by Donne for the fair sex, for women, what he meant perhaps. But we see that the influence of the age, the relationship between text and context is very visibly evident, visibly seen in the poetry of metaphysical. And we see that how the poetry of Herbert is full of religious images. The poetry of Vaux, he has images from nature. This is what we saw when we read their poetry. So we see that as far as images are concerned, the metaphysicals are again very much varied. They have varied images. They come with different images, and that's why again you cannot put your finger and say that this is what is called metaphysical image. But at the same time, you are sure that the eclecticism is found, references to the new world in which they all live, we see in their poetry, and again images. Now later we come to a very important issue or important aspect of metaphysical poetry. In the beginning, at the very outset, I referred to this, and that is unification of sensibility in metaphysical poetry. And the whole idea of metaphysical sensibility, this is a new term perhaps, the metaphysical sensibility, what we call. Now, what is sensibility after all? Sensibility is not something what we call emotions perhaps. Sensibility is perhaps your whole being, which is actually constructed in the age in which you live. And that's why metaphysical sensibility is certainly different from some other sensibility, for example, romantic sensibility,
Emotional,
or some other sensibility, the Elizabethan sensibility. And this is what we see. So I would like to refer to Eliot's essay, and I would like to recommend this essay to my students, the Metaphysical Poetry, written in 1921. So do read this essay. This is a very important essay as far as the metaphysical poets are concerned, and how Eliot regenerates our interest in the metaphysicals after the gap of about 300 years. They were totally forgotten. They were totally in oblivion. And this is amazing that this very important group of poets, how they were forgotten in history. So we see that later, this is an important poem by John Donne, but we don't discuss the poem, Yet Be Not Proud.
we shall listen to
We
it.
simply listen to this poem before we conclude. Before that, we'll conclude this particular discussion. In short, we can say that metaphysical poetry is a genre of English poetry, and it is different from other schools of poetry or other poems in the use of the radical use of imagery or rational and argumentative structure, the colloquial use of language, the dramatic use of language. It is different as far as love and religion are actually talked about in poetry. And before we end, we will listen to the audio tape of Death Be Not Proud.
Click करूंगा. डबल क्लिक करो. चलो ऑडियो
ऑडियो का नहीं ચાલુ જશે સ્ક્રીન પાસે ચાલુ જશે ये कर लो बस कंट्रोल कर दो